The scent of burnt coffee and grease hung thick in the air of Tony's highway diner, a smell that had permanently woven itself into Isabella Chen's pale blue uniform. At 7:45 in the morning, the breakfast rush was a cacophony of clattering dishes, barked orders, and the constant hum of conversations that would be forgotten by noon. Isabella moved through the chaos with practiced efficiency, her stained white apron a testament to 16-hour shifts. She was 31 years old, and her entire life felt like a perpetual loop of refilling coffee for exhausted truck drivers, smiling at families with screaming toddlers, and mentally calculating whether her tips would cover both rent and her mother's medication this month. It was a life lived in constant motion, always serving, never resting. Then they walked in. The atmosphere in the diner shifted immediately. The warm chaos suddenly felt colder, as if the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. He was a man who seemed carved from granite and violence, his charcoal suit so perfectly tailored that it looked almost offensive against the cracked vinyl booth he chose. His eyes, dark and calculating, swept across the room with the kind of dismissive assessment that made Isabella feel invisible. Beside him, clutching his arm with trembling hands, was a fragile elderly woman wrapped in an exquisite emerald silk kimono embroidered with golden phoenixes. Her face was a delicate landscape of wrinkles, her movements painfully slow. As she settled into the booth, Isabella grabbed 2 menus and a fresh pot of coffee, her professional smile already fixed firmly in place. If you're just coming across my channel, do me a favor by subscribing right now. You won't believe how happy if you subscribed, and may I know where you're watching? Don't forget to turn on post notification from your end as well. All right, let's continue. As she approached their table, the man was speaking rapidly into his phone in clipped Japanese, his voice a low rumble of authority and command. He waved a dismissive hand in Isabella's direction without even glancing up, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenient interruption. Isabella simply placed the menus on the scratched table and began pouring coffee for the elderly woman, whose hands shook visibly as she reached for the cup. It was in that moment that the woman's eyes, clouded with age but suddenly sharp with recognition, locked onto Isabella's face. A spark of something powerful flickered within them, eye-cutting through what seemed like years of fog and confusion. Her thin lips parted, and a single trembling finger rose to point directly at Isabella. "Son," she whispered in heavily accented English, her voice thin but remarkably clear, cutting through the diner's noise and her son's urgent phone conversation. "That one, that waitress, she cared for me at the nursing home." Takeshi Yamamoto's irritation was immediate and visceral, a tight coil of annoyance in his chest. His mother, Fumiko, had been experiencing episodes of confusion for the past 18 months, a side effect the physicians at the Evergreen Estates facility had explicitly warned him about. He paid them an astronomical sum of $14,000 every single month, automatically wired on the first of each month without fail, to ensure she received the absolute best care that money could purchase. He had personally reviewed the brochures himself, studied the photographs of smiling residents in sun-drenched gardens, examined the staff-to-resident ratio that was advertised as the finest in the state. He had signed every check, fulfilled every financial obligation, and carefully compartmentalized the guilt that occasionally surfaced in quiet moments. Seeing her now, pointing a shaking finger at a random waitress in this cheap roadside diner, only sharpened that carefully suppressed guilt into a defensive wall of anger. He ended his phone call abruptly with a curt word in Japanese. "Mother, please," he said, his voice low and controlled, designed to shut down this embarrassing scene before it escalated. "You are confused. This is just a restaurant." But Fumiko's gaze did not waver even slightly. It remained absolutely fixed on the young woman standing frozen beside their table, coffee pot still in hand, her expression showing a mixture of surprise and genuine concern. Takeshi sighed heavily, preparing to apologize for his mother's outburst and leave immediately. It was always easier to run from these situations, to throw money at the problem and retreat back into his world of concrete towers and quarterly profit margins. But for the first time in many years, his mother was insistent, her voice gaining unexpected strength. "No," she said firmly. "Isabella. Her name is Isabella Chen." The use of a specific name stopped him completely cold. It was too detailed to be random confusion. It was too clear to be a hallucination. His gaze, for the first time, truly fell upon the waitress standing before them. He saw not just a uniform or a service worker, but an actual person. He noticed the deep exhaustion etched around her kind eyes, the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite the obvious awkwardness of this situation. He watched as an elderly man at the counter fumbled with his wallet, dropping coins that scattered loudly across the stained floor. Without a single moment's hesitation, Isabella was there, kneeling on the grimy linoleum, helping the confused man gather his scattered change with a gentle smile and reassuring words. There was a patience in that simple gesture, a genuine warmth that couldn't possibly be manufactured or faked. It was exactly the kind of attentive care he paid enormous sums of money for, yet had never once witnessed with his own eyes. A cold dread, heavier than any failed business negotiation he'd ever experienced, began to seep slowly into his bones. What if his mother wasn't confused at all? What if she was seeing clearly for the first time in months? Isabella felt the weight of the man's analytical stare like physical pressure against her skin. It was a gaze that stripped away her uniform and her professional smile, searching for something she couldn't begin to comprehend. She had seen looks like that before, usually from men who viewed her as either an object or an obstacle. But this was fundamentally different. This was calculating, measuring, trying to solve an equation. The old woman, Fumiko, had said her name out loud. The sound of it in this strange context sent an electric jolt through Isabella's entire body. She searched the woman's weathered face carefully, trying to push past the spiderweb of wrinkles and the cloudy gaze, and then suddenly she saw it clearly. It wasn't a memory of a face exactly, but rather the memory of a feeling. The visceral memory of small, ice-cold hands gripping hers desperately for comfort during a 3 a.m. room change in sterile silence. The memory of a silent woman who would sit motionless and watch sparrows outside her window for hours on end, never speaking, barely moving. It was Mrs. Yamamoto. That's what the staff had called her at Evergreen Estates. A resident who rarely spoke more than a handful of words, whose file prominently noted that her wealthy son paid for an expensive private suite, but had only visited twice in the entire year Isabella had worked there. "Mrs. Yamamoto," Isabella whispered, the name feeling strange and foreign outside the hushed antiseptic corridors of the nursing home. The woman's eyes immediately filled with tears, and she gave a small but unmistakable nod of confirmation. Takeshi's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The surface annoyance evaporated completely, replaced by a tense, dangerous stillness that seemed to fill the entire booth. "You will sit with us," he commanded, his voice no longer dismissive but instead laced with an unnerving intensity that made it absolutely clear this was not a request. Isabella hesitated for just a moment, glancing nervously toward her boss behind the counter, but the look on Takeshi's face told her that refusing this demand was simply not an option she had. She carefully placed the coffee pot on an adjacent empty table and slid into the cracked vinyl booth directly opposite them. The air between them crackled with unspoken questions and barely contained tension. Takeshi leaned forward across the table, his expensive cologne a jarring contrast to the smell of fried eggs and burnt toast. "My mother says you cared for her," he stated, the demand for explanation blunt and direct. But beneath the surface command, Isabella could clearly hear a tremor of something else entirely. Not anger exactly, but a deep, profoundly unsettling fear of what the answer might be. The diner suddenly faded completely away from Isabella's awareness, and the sharp antiseptic smell of the Evergreen Estates facility filled her senses as if she were standing there right now. She was transported back to that place of forced smiles and quiet desperation, a place where genuine kindness was a currency far more valuable and infinitely rarer than the massive amounts of money that funded its operations. The Evergreen Estates facility was aggressively marketed as a paradise for elderly residents, a final luxurious chapter in life's journey. The lobby was always filled with fresh exotic flowers and the constant soft sound of a grand piano playing classical music. But beyond that pristine, carefully maintained facade, the grim reality was one of profound systemic neglect, sustained by a skeleton crew of desperately overworked and severely underpaid caregivers stretched impossibly thin. Isabella had initially taken the job purely out of financial necessity, but she had stayed because she simply couldn't bear to abandon the residents to their fate. She remembered Fumiko with vivid, painful clarity. She was known among the staff as the silent one, the resident who never caused trouble or made demands. Most of the staff left her completely alone, marking their medical charts with brisk, impersonal efficiency. They would drop off her food tray without a word, deliver her medication in silence, and immediately leave without any real interaction. But Isabella had seen the profound loneliness in Fumiko's eyes, a deep, cavernous sorrow that 1,000 sun-drenched gardens could never begin to fill. Isabella had made it her personal mission to truly connect with this silent, forgotten woman. She learned through patient observation that Fumiko loved the color green, the delicate scent of jasmine flowers, and the specific taste of sweet red bean paste. So Isabella had started wearing a small jade pin on her uniform every single day. She brought in a small potted jasmine plant for Fumiko's windowsill using her own limited money. On her precious days off, she would spend countless hours in her own tiny apartment kitchen, learning from online videos how to properly make dorayaki, those simple Japanese pancakes with sweet red bean filling. The first time she had brought one to Fumiko on a small plate, the woman had stared at the homemade cake for a long moment, then looked up at Isabella with something like wonder, and for the first time in many months, she had spoken a single word in soft Japanese. Arigato. Thank you. Isabella had used her phone to painstakingly learn other simple Japanese phrases. Oyasumi nasai. Good night. Ohayo gozaimasu. Good morning. She would carefully brush Fumiko's long, silvery hair with gentle strokes, humming old tunes her own grandmother used to sing to her as a child. She discovered through these quiet moments that Fumiko had once been a recognized master of ikebana, the traditional art of Japanese flower arrangement. So Isabella began bringing her flowers regularly, not the sterile, expensive arrangements displayed in the facility lobby, but simple wildflowers, daisies, and dandelions she picked herself from a field near her apartment building. They weren't grand or impressive, but they were real. They were alive. They were proof that someone actually saw her not as a room number or a monthly payment plan, but as a real human being with a past and preferences and feelings. Isabella was showing up in a place where the one person who should have been there never did. You worked at the Evergreen Estates facility. Takeshi's voice cut sharply through her memories like a blade. Isabella flinched slightly, and they brought abruptly back to the sticky tabletop of the diner booth. She nodded slowly, her throat feeling tight and dry. Yes, for about 14 months. I was laid off 3 months ago. Takeshi's knuckles turned bone white where he gripped the edge of the table with barely controlled force. The carefully constructed world he had built around his mother's care was beginning to crumble and crack, revealing the rotten, hollow foundation beneath. He had outsourced his love and responsibility, paid an enormous premium for what he assumed was a professional service, and blindly assumed that the extraordinarily high price tag automatically guaranteed high-quality care. He had fundamentally mistaken a financial transaction for genuine human connection and compassion. Laid off, he repeated, his voice dangerously low and controlled. Why exactly? Isabella looked down at her worn hands, remembering with painful clarity the cold, clinical meeting with the facility's corporate administrator. I was told I was inefficient, she said quietly, the shame still fresh. I was spending too much personal time with individual residents. It was negatively affecting my ability to complete my assigned checklist of duties for the entire wing, according to the mandatory schedule. They said my personal attachments to residents were unprofessional and interfered with proper operations. The words hung heavily in the air between them, a damning indictment of a system that ruthlessly prioritized efficient checklists over basic human compassion. Takeshi felt a genuine wave of nausea wash over him. He had been paying $14,000 a month for efficient checklists. He had been paying someone to systematically neglect his mother while carefully maintaining a perfect illusion of quality care. He looked at Fumiko, who was now holding Isabella's hand tightly across the table, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. He saw the genuine, undeniable affection shining in his mother's eyes, a light of real happiness he hadn't seen in years, maybe decades. It was a light that this woman, this minimum-wage waitress, had somehow sparked back to life while he was busy in corporate boardrooms building a financial empire that suddenly felt completely worthless and hollow. Before we continue with this story, make sure you're subscribed to Mafia History Decoded. We bring you true stories that reveal what really matters in life. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that touches the heart. The truth was a bitter pill lodged in Takeshi's throat, and he was choking on it. He had not just failed his mother through absence. He had paid handsomely for the privilege of doing so, funding her neglect with his own money. The transformation in Takeshi was absolutely seismic. The cold, seemingly impenetrable businessman visibly receded, and in his place emerged a son drowning in profound shame and regret. He waved away his two bodyguards who had been hovering protectively by the diner entrance, their intimidating presence suddenly feeling like an obscene display of the power he had so catastrophically misused. His phone buzzed incessantly on the table between them. A constant stream of urgent business demands from an empire that no longer held any of his attention or interest. He silenced it with a sharp, decisive tap of his finger. Everything in his world had suddenly narrowed to this small, cracked vinyl booth, to this woman whose quiet integrity and simple human decency had just completely shattered his carefully constructed reality. "I want you to tell me everything," he said. And for perhaps the first time in decades, his voice held no command or authority, only a raw, desperate plea for understanding. He looked at Isabella, truly seeing her now, not as a waitress or a former employee or a stranger, but as the sole guardian of a truth he desperately, urgently needed to understand. He tried instinctively to fall back on his old established methods, and his only known way of fixing problems and making things right. He reached automatically for his expensive leather wallet. "I will compensate you generously for your time, for everything you can tell me." Isabella gently but firmly shook her head, her gaze absolutely unwavering as she met his eyes directly. "That isn't necessary at all. What your mother needed, what they all desperately need in that place, it isn't something you can possibly buy with money." Her words were not delivered as an accusation or judgment, but as a simple, undeniable statement of fact, and they landed with far more devastating force than any physical blow possibly could. They exposed with brutal clarity the poverty of his soul, the emptiness at the core of all his wealth and power. He had an infinite capacity to write checks and transfer funds, but he had completely forgotten how to simply show up as a human being. He finally understood with crystal clarity. This wasn't about money or compensation. This was about justice. It was about reclaiming the basic human dignity that had been systematically stolen from his mother, carefully hidden behind fraudulent corporate reports and meaningless 5-star ratings. He made a decision in that moment that would change everything. "I am going to completely destroy that place," he said, his voice a low, chilling promise of absolute certainty. Not just the facility itself, but the entire corporation behind it, every executive, every board member, and I need your help to do it properly. He slid a black business card across the scarred table surface. "Quit this job, today. Right now, you work for me now." It was phrased as an order, But the entire context had fundamentally changed. It was no longer the command of a superior to an inferior, but the desperate request of an ally, a broken man asking for a guide through the wreckage he had unknowingly created and funded. The transition from the greasy highway diner to Takeshi's downtown penthouse was a dizzying, disorienting culture shock that left Isabella's head spinning. She had gone directly from a world of cracked vinyl seats and the perpetual smell of burnt toast to a minimalist expanse of floor-to-ceiling glass, polished steel, and gleaming white marble that overlooked the entire sprawling city below. The silence was perhaps the most jarring element of all. It was a heavy, expensive silence broken only by the distant, muted hum of the metropolis far below. Takeshi had been absolutely true to his word with frightening efficiency. Within less than 1 hour, one of his stern-faced associates had arrived at the diner, handed Isabella's shocked boss a thick stack of crisp $100 bills that made his eyes nearly bulge out of his head, and escorted both Isabella and Fumiko to a sleek black Mercedes with tinted windows. Now, Fumiko was resting peacefully in a guest suite that was larger than Isabella's entire studio apartment, tucked carefully into sheets with a thread count that was probably higher than Isabella's credit score. Takeshi had changed out of his bespoke suit into simple black trousers and a charcoal cashmere sweater, but he still radiated an unmistakable aura of immense controlled power. It was just redirected now, all focused with laser-like intensity on the task immediately at hand. He led Isabella to a massive glass table where a thin silver laptop and a single thick manila file folder sat waiting ominously. "This is the file Evergreen Estates sent me every single month," he explained, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. He opened it slowly, revealing page after page of glossy professional photographs showing smiling residents in beautiful gardens, glowing testimonials from satisfied families, and detailed daily reports on Fumiko's supposed health and activities, all meticulously, deliberately forged. "Enjoyed social hour in the garden," he read one entry aloud, each lie a fresh stab of guilt and rage. "Participated enthusiastically in group art therapy, excellent appetite and spirits throughout the day." His jaw clenched visibly. "She hates gardens. She has absolutely no interest in art therapy, and you told me she barely ate anything." He looked directly at Isabella, his dark eyes filled with a pain that resonated powerfully with her own burning anger at the corrupt system. "I need you to tell me the complete truth. I need you to give a voice to what they deliberately tried to silence and hide." He pushed the thick file folder across the glass surface toward her. In that pivotal moment, they were no longer a mafia boss and a waitress. They were two people united by a shared, burning purpose: to expose a cruel, systematic deception and bring a powerful voice to the forgotten and voiceless. The fight for real justice had officially begun. Over the following intense days, the penthouse was completely transformed into their war room and command center. The massive glass table was soon covered entirely in legal documents, detailed financial statements, and Isabella's careful handwritten notes documenting every instance of neglect she had witnessed. They worked side by side for 12, sometimes 16 hours at a stretch, fueled by endless black coffee and a burning, almost obsessive sense of purpose and mission. In this crucible of shared intense focus, the carefully constructed walls between them began to slowly dissolve and crumble. Late one night, surrounded by spreadsheets detailing the parent company's obscene profit margins and executive compensation packages, Takeshi finally spoke openly of the profound guilt that had haunted him for years. "After my father died," he began, his voice barely above a whisper as he stared out at the glittering city lights stretching to the horizon, "I buried myself completely in his work, expanding the organization, increasing our territory and influence. It was all I knew how to do. It was so much easier than actually feeling anything real. I saw my mother's grief after losing him, and instead of facing it together with her, I saw it as just another problem that needed to be efficiently solved. So I found the most expensive solution money could buy, and I wrote a check." He turned slowly to look at Isabella, his expression completely stripped of all its usual authority and control, leaving only profound vulnerability exposed. I wasn't just absent from her life. I was a coward who ran away from my responsibility. Isabella listened carefully, her heart genuinely aching for the lonely boy who had hidden all his grief and fear behind an impenetrable fortress of money and power. She found herself sharing her own painful story, telling him about the grandmother who had raised her with love, whose final difficult years were spent in a terrible state-run facility that smelled permanently of despair and disinfectant. "I became a professional caregiver because I couldn't be there for her at the end," she confessed, her own voice thick with emotion and old regret. "I promised myself I would give to complete strangers the kindness and attention I had failed to give my own family." They were two sides of the exact same coin, both running from a past failure, both desperately trying to atone through their current actions. Later that same evening, as Isabella's stomach rumbled with hunger, Takeshi disappeared without explanation into the state-of-the-art kitchen. He returned several minutes later, not with expensive takeout from a five-star restaurant, but with 2 steaming bowls of katsudon, a simple traditional dish of breaded pork cutlet and egg over rice. He had actually cooked for her himself. It was a clumsy, clearly unpracticed gesture, but it was infinitely more meaningful than any five-star meal could ever be. As they ate together in comfortable silence, he found himself watching her hands closely. The same hands that had poured coffee in a highway diner, that had gently brushed his mother's hair, were now confidently highlighting fraudulent entries in complex corporate ledgers with precise efficiency. He was falling deeply in love, not just with her obvious kindness, but with her unexpected strength and fierce intelligence. The complete downfall of Omnicare Corporation, the massive parent company of Evergreen Estates and 47 other similar facilities, was remarkably swift and absolutely brutal. Armed with Isabella's detailed, devastating testimony of systematic neglect and Takeshi's immense financial resources and connections, they unleashed a coordinated legal and media firestorm that consumed everything in its path. Isabella provided the emotional heart of the entire story, the undeniable human cost hidden behind corporate marketing. She spoke publicly of residents left sitting in soiled clothes for hours, of emergency call buttons deliberately ignored, of the profound, crushing loneliness that was the true sickness poisoning that place. Takeshi provided the muscle and the strategic coordination. His team of ruthless corporate lawyers and private investigators uncovered a massive, intricate scheme of insurance fraud, systematic embezzlement, and criminal negligence that went all the way to the board of directors and major shareholders. The story was absolutely explosive and dominated news cycles. Television channels ran nightly investigative segments showcasing the stark, disturbing contrast between Omnicare's compassionate marketing materials and the grim reality that Isabella described in heartbreaking detail. The company's stock price plummeted catastrophically. The chief executive officer was forced to resign in complete disgrace, and multiple federal criminal investigations were immediately launched. But Takeshi didn't stop there, didn't consider the job finished. This had never been just about punishment or revenge. It was fundamentally about redemption and transformation. In a move that absolutely stunned the entire financial world and made headlines internationally, he orchestrated a hostile takeover of the crippled Omnicare Corporation, purchasing it at a fraction of its former value. He didn't liquidate the assets and walk away with profit. Instead, he completely gutted the entire corrupt executive board and announced the immediate formation of the Fumiko Yamamoto Foundation, a new nonprofit entity that would now directly control the entire network of 47 facilities across 6 states. Its new sole mission, backed by an enormous endowment, was to create and maintain a completely new standard of elder care based entirely on dignity, respect, and genuine human connection rather than profit margins. One quiet evening, they stood together on the balcony of the penthouse, watching a news report detail the grand opening of the first of the newly reformed care homes. Fumiko was inside the penthouse behind them, sleeping peacefully in her own room. a genuine smile of contentment on her weathered face. Takeshi turned slowly to face Isabella, the city lights reflecting in his dark eyes. "You did this," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never once heard from him before. "You showed me that true power isn't about control or money or influence. It's about how you actually care for people." He took her hand gently in his touch tender. "I spent my entire life building an empire of shadows and violence. You build entire worlds in small, quiet rooms with nothing but your heart and your hands. I don't want to be in the shadows anymore. Please, Isabella, build a new world with me." Their wedding was the complete antithesis of everything Takeshi's life had represented for 4 decades. There were no powerful figures making backroom deals in hushed corners, no ostentatious displays of wealth or power. It was held in the tranquil Japanese garden of a small private estate, with only a handful of carefully chosen people in attendance. Fumiko sat in the front row, radiant in a kimono the exact color of cherry blossoms, her eyes sparkling with a joy that transcended an entire lifetime of accumulated sorrow. Takeshi's most trusted men stood somewhat awkwardly in the background, their normally formidable presence considerably softened by the unfamiliar task of witnessing such a genuinely tender moment. One of them, a mountain of a man with a heavily scarred face and hands like sledgehammers, was discreetly seen wiping a tear from his eye. Isabella wore a simple, elegant ivory dress, her natural beauty far outshining any expensive jewelry. When Takeshi saw her walking slowly toward him down the garden path, and his carefully maintained composure completely crumbled. Here was his redemption walking toward him, his hope, his future, all embodied in the gentle strength of this one incredible woman. He had offered her a world of riches and luxury, but what they had found together was something far more precious and rare, a shared purpose. Their new life together began not with a lavish honeymoon on some tropical island, but with a visit to the first of the new Fumiko Yamamoto care homes. The building was bright and airy, filled with the genuine scent of fresh flowers and home-cooked food, not harsh disinfectant and institutional cleaners. The staff weren't rushed or stressed. They were sitting comfortably with residents, reading together, talking, actually listening. Isabella walked slowly through the halls, not as an employee or a visitor, but as the co-founder, her hard-won insights shaping every single policy, her compassion the fundamental guiding principle of the entire foundation. Takeshi walked beside her, no longer a ruler of shadows but a true partner. He had learned the hard way that protecting his family wasn't about building higher walls or making bigger threats, but about opening doors to let the light in. One peaceful afternoon, they sat together with Fumiko in the garden, watching her teach a small, attentive group of residents the ancient art of ikebana flower arrangement. She was laughing freely, her hands steady and confident as she arranged the delicate flowers. Takeshi reached for Isabella's hand, his heart completely full. He had spent an entire lifetime accumulating power and wealth, only to discover that the greatest strength he would ever know was the quiet, unwavering love of the woman sitting next to him. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Mafia History Decoded for more true stories that reveal what really matters. Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from.